Yes, I was asked to talk about the World Centre tonight with some idea of its development in the past and its development in the future. So we'll see how the time goes and see how we can cover the subject. The World Centre, you know, the World Centre of the Faith is really two things. One is its geographical location. The other is it's a series of institutions, and the two, of course, are very closely interlinked. The two have been linked from long before the Baha'i World Centre arrived in Israel, because from the Bayan and the laws of the Bab, we know that the Qibla, the point of adoration of the faith, was to be He whom God would make manifest. And it would move wherever He moved until He stayed in one place. And this is what happened. So the World Centre, if you're reading your Baha'i history, was wherever Baha'u'llah was, until he arrived in the Holy Land, and then the World Centre, as it were, settled in the Holy Land. And the geographical location of the World Centre is a number of holy sites and institutions, quite widespread. The Universal House of Justice has been working on having the Baha'i World Centre recognized as a World Heritage Site. And what makes it a bit different for the people dealing with the World Centre is the fact that it's a number of different places. It is to start with Akka. It's Bahji, just outside Akka. It's Mazrai, north of Bahji. It includes Baha'i cemetery in Ein Geb, where the faithful half-brother of Abdul Baha is buried, and his family. And it includes Haifa, and many parts of Haifa. This is all the World Centre. And when you go on pilgrimage, which is what you're going to see something of in the DVD tonight, you visit the Baha'i holy places in the World Centre. Not all of them, but most of them you can get to. And you also see the new institutions which have arisen in the World Centre. Because the World Centre evolved quite slowly. You know, Baha'u'llah had amanuenses, friends who were with him, who took the dictation of his tablets, and who copied his tablets. There are a number of amanuenses. There was one who was nearly always with him, who is known as Khadimullah, Khadim, the servant of God. He was the one who used to take down the dictation of the tablets of Baha'u'llah in what we've come to call revelation writing. It's writing Persian or Arabic with such speed that it just looks like a series of strokes on paper. But he could read back that writing. So after having taken the dictation from Baha'u'llah, he would then make a fair copy of the tablet. And we have, in the archives at the World Centre, copies of tablets in revelation writing and copies of the fair copy that Khadimullah made, and then the notes that were made to correct the fair copy, because he would read over the tablet to Baha'u'llah and ask him questions about places where he wasn't quite sure. And some years ago they were examining these documents in the archives and weren't quite sure what these funny little marks and things in the margins were for. And by studying the situation they found this is what it was. There were certain questions that Khadim wanted to put to Baha'u'llah. There were certain changes to be made. Then he would make, or another amanuensis would copy down a fair copy of the tablet, and it would be sent out. Then we have other services that were performed, particularly by one of the amanuenses, Zainul Magharibin. He was so faithful that Baha'u'llah has written that any tablet in the handwriting of Zainul Magharibin is as good as an original. And Baha'u'llah would use quite often, when dictating his tablets, the style similar to that of the Bab, in which the Bab ignored a lot of the rules of Arabic grammar. Now, as you may know, grammarians concoct grammars from what they find people use in their languages. We tend to think of the grammar being there first and then the language, but it's the other way around. I don't know why the Bab chose to violate so many of the rules of Arabic grammar, but I think it may be partly to demonstrate the authority of the manifestation of God over even the grammar of the language he's using. There were other things that Baha'u'llah did, and they're very, you see, Baha'u'llah wasn't A, he wasn't stupid, and B, he didn't just accidentally do things. And you'll find often in the writings of Baha'u'llah, he will quote the Bab's writings, or he will quote his own writings, obviously from memory. And what he quoted is not always identical with the earlier revealed tablet. Now, why would he do that? I think one of the reasons is to teach us not to be fanatical. Because this has been a problem in many religions, that people kill one another because of little details of the writings. And Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and after them Shoghi Effendi have tried to train us to read the writings in the context of all the writings, not to hang ourselves by little commas and details of any particular passage. So this is part of the World Centre, how it worked. I won't go into any more examples of that at the moment, but there are very interesting examples of how we have, in fact, in some famous tablets, 3 equally valid copies of the tablet that are all slightly different from one another. Now when Abdul Baha, of course, succeeded Baha'u'llah, he also had secretaries who would write for him. And there are accounts by pilgrims of Abdul Baha dictating tablets simultaneously to 5 different secretaries. He'd dictate a bit to one, a bit more to another, and that would be 5 different tablets, and he would do them bit by bit to all 5 and go back, and when the first one was getting near his bit finished, he would do the next bit of that tablet. And it gives you a little idea of the volume of the writing that had to be undertaken by, in this case, Abdul Baha. Because the world centre of the faith was so often in prison. In Tehran, in Baghdad, in Adrianople, in Constantinople. Baha'u'llah couldn't go around teaching his faith any more than for most of his life Abdul Baha could visit the Baha'is, or the Baha'is could visit him. So much of this revelation had to be in writing, not just because Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha wanted it that way, but because it was the one way to get the message to the friends and to the world as a whole. So from very early days you have this pattern at the World Centre of the source of the guidance and the friends serving to put that into writing and to send it out. After the passing of Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, who was a young man in his early 20s, found himself with this incredible burden of being the guardian of the cause of God. Now, he had been studying English in Oxford with the hope of becoming very fluent in that language to help, as a secretary, Abdu'l-Baha, to translate his tablets, to help in some way or another. And he thought that maybe Abdu'l-Baha would give him the task of calling the election of the Universal House of Justice. And it was a tremendous blow to him. And you think, at your age, a young man, suddenly, with this burden of being the guardian of the cause of God placed on your shoulders. And this is what Shoghi Effendi found. And he needed people to help him. Quite early in his ministry, he called a number of prominent Baha'is from different parts of the world to consult with him in Haifa, with the thought that they could perhaps call the election of the Universal House of Justice. And he found it was impossible. The friends weren't mature enough, and it needed a basis. You can't just get it out of the air. So he then began to build the whole administrative order from the basis upwards. It had already been started, of course, with Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, but this whole structure was being built up. So when you look back at the life of Shoghi Effendi, you find that those 36 years he labored to achieve a number of aims. Now, I don't think he had these as aims at the beginning. In fact, we know he didn't. Because Leroy Iowis once was talking with the Guardian. Leroy Iowis is one of the hands of the cause who served in Haifa. And the Guardian said, Leroy, do you think that when I began to write to the Friends, building the administrative order, I had this whole thing laid out like a pattern before me, and then I gradually applied it? And Leroy said, well, frankly, Shoghi Effendi, yes, I did think that. He said, it's not true. Abdu'l-Baha had said I would be guided, and I trusted to Abdu'l-Baha to follow what I felt to be right. And stage by stage, as decisions had to be made, I made them. And that was how the whole administrative order was built up. So during his ministry, he built up the administrative order to the point that where he appointed the International Baha'i Council and laid down how this should be evolved into the Universal House of Justice. To the point where he appointed hands of the cause of God, when he gave them auxiliary boards, when he had the national and local spiritual assemblies functioning well, and when he'd given the whole Baha'i world a 10-year plan. So everything that had to be carried forward, he'd got moving. And then, to the horror of the Baha'is at the time, I remember it well, he died in the middle of the 10-year crusade in 1957. A young man, like 61. And then the World Center had to undergo a tremendous transformation. The hands of the cause of God found themselves in charge of the work of the cause without the guarantee of divine guidance. This, I think, was their tremendous burden of having to guide the cause without being sure that they were right. And it was a colossal burden. And they achieved it by steadfastly pursuing the goals the Guardian had set for the 10-year crusade and being sure not to change a thing. In Baha'i, for example, there are the rooms furnished and there are bits of bowls, Japanese bowls and other things on various tables. And the hands were sure that nothing was changed. If there was a bowl on the table in that corner, someone thought it looked much nicer if it was over here. No. You put it back there. That's where the Guardian had it, or where it was last, when he passed away. Changed nothing. So they, as it were, froze the development of the World Center for those 6 years, from 1957 to 1963. They kept the cause going, but they had to hold things steadily. And they passed the cause on to the Universal House of Justice, unviolated, unchanged, with its 10-year crusade completed. One of the hands of the cause, as we know, broke the covenant. That didn't upset things either. I mean, it was a test and a tragedy that someone who had been such a faithful Baha'i, Charles Mason Reamy, should have broken the covenant, but it didn't distress or disturb the growth of the cause. Now, the way this relates to the World Centre is that then, when the House of Justice came into being, it had to examine what was to happen. It had the task of deciding whether or not it would be possible to appoint a successor to Shoghi Effendi, or to make a law that would make it possible to appoint a successor to Shoghi Effendi. As you know, it decided it couldn't in those two cases. Then there's the question, what would be the relationship of the House of Justice to the hands? What would be the relationship of the auxiliary board members to the House of Justice? All these various things had to be re-examined, and the Guardian had written about the House of Justice that it would have to re-examine everything, and this is what it had to do. So it had to do this and had to catch up in those years when nothing had evolved. I remember in the Shrine of Baha'u'llah, for example, there's an apse at the end. The shrine, as you know, you enter the Shrine of Baha'u'llah through a door, and there's a room which used to be a courtyard, and it's now a room with a glass roof and a garden in the middle, and then you turn right and the Shrine of Baha'u'llah is in the corner. Just next to the shrine there's a sort of apse, a little raised place where you get in behind, and there's a ceiling above that apse, and it's got beams and little boards on top and so on. When I went there in 1961, this was covered with plywood, because the Guardian had been saving money for the work of the crusade, and the roof was not very sound. The sand kept on drifting down through the roof, through the boards. And instead of rebuilding the roof, all that he and the hands could do was to tack up plywood underneath it to hold it together. And in many parts of the World Centre, it was just held like this. So the House of Justice had to then re-examine it. And this was very interesting in the way the World Centre functioned when I first was there in 1961, because 61 was before the election of the House of Justice, of course. It was the time when the International Council had to be elected. When the Guardian appointed the International Council, which was a group of friends to assist him in his work, he said it should, in due course, become an elected body, and then eventually effloresce into the Universal House of Justice. So in 61, it was elected, and it had 9 members. And the hands continued the practice of the Guardian to have the International Council help them in their work in relation to the authorities, in looking after the buildings and so on. And so the council had all sorts of jobs. And I think it was either in those early days of the council, or more likely just after the House of Justice was elected. I remember one day there was an SOS from the Pilgrim House that the roof was leaking. And then there was very few staff at the World Centre. There were the house members and their wives and the hands of the cause and their families, and some custodians of holy places. So when the roof leaked, a member of the House of Justice had to go up to the Pilgrim House and climb up in the loft and examine the roof, and notice that in fact all the tiles needed replacing. So the next summer we had to replace the tiles on the roof of the Shrine of Baha'u'llah, Shrine of Ampleforth. Sorry, it wasn't the Shrine of Ampleforth. This was the Pilgrim House in this case. Later also we had to change the roof of the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. But for quite some time, the World Centre was, as it were, doing repairs and maintenance. And it's a very wonderful experience to do this sort of work on a holy place. Because a holy place is not just an ordinary building. And the House of Justice always had to, as the Guardian had before, to train the friends who were doing this work not to improve things. If a window in a holy place is slightly cockeyed, and that's the way it was, when you have to put a new frame in, you put in a slightly cockeyed new frame. That's how it was in the time of Baha'u'llah. So you preserve things as they are. It's so easy when you improve things to migrate slowly from what it originally was to something quite different from what it was. So this brings us to the material things of the World Centre. And the first of the material things is the holy places, which have to be preserved and protected and acquired. Because we didn't, as we still don't, possess all the places that are related to Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, the Guardian. But I remember the wonderful experience we had with the purchase of Mazrai. Now Mazrai had been rented. This is the little mansion north of Baha'i, where Baha'u'llah lived, where you go out in the country, and where he saw the country for the first time after all those years of being imprisoned in Akka, and all you can see there is the sea and the houses and the no green things. And so we had possession of Mazrai, but we didn't own it. And so the House of Justice began to investigate how we could acquire ownership of Mazrai. We found, in fact, that it was a Muslim waqf. Now, a waqf is an endowment, a religious endowment. And in Muslim countries, usually, an endowment has what they call a mutawalli. Now, someone, usually hereditary, who is in charge of this property. And the mutawalli of the waqf of Mazrai lived in Turkey. And so we managed to get in touch with her and negotiated the purchase of Mazrai. In the process, we found that this dear lady was also the mutawalli of the mansion of Abdullah Pasha, of the house of Abdullah Pasha in Akka. So we were then able to move forward to purchase the house of Abdullah Pasha, which is where Abdul Baha was living. He'd rented it, of course, he didn't own it, living in the time that the first Western pilgrims visited the Holy Land. So it's a very precious property. When Mazrai was acquired, that's not when we bought it, but when we fell into the hands of the faith, the Guardian was still alive. He was able to furnish it. He said what's to be done there, how the pilgrims were to be received, which rooms they'd visit. When the house of Abdullah Pasha was acquired, this was after the passing of the Guardian, in the time of the House of Justice. How do you restore a building like this, which is a holy place? We were very lucky to find that the aunt of Mr. Ali Nakhjavani, whose name was Zinat Baghdadi, when she was a girl, had served as a maid in the house of Abdul Baha. She had not only lived in the house of Abdul Pasha, she cleaned it. She swept the floor, she cleaned the windows, she looked after the building. So we were able to get her, who was in Lebanon, to dictate from her memories what each room was like. For example, it's very important for her to say what the floor was like, whether it was tile, whether it was concrete, what it was, because that is a very old building, much older than the time Abdul Baha was there. So if you went back through the floor to the earliest floor, you would go straight past where Abdul Baha had been and get something too early. So the restoration had to be very delicately done. So she recorded all her memories, and then later, via Cyprus, she was brought to the Holy Land, and she came to the house of Abdullah Pasha and looked at it in the light of the notes that she made. And she would say, for example, there used to be a door through that wall. So along we'd come with chisels and hack away at the wall. Sure enough, there was the doorway. So we could replace that. And also at the same time, whereas she had seen the whole of the inside of the house and worked on it, and knew what the garden outside looked like from the windows, we had a Baha'i who, as a young boy, had worked in the garden. And he knew what the building looked like from outside. So that was how the house of Abdullah Pasha was restored. This sort of delicate work, trying to get back to the most accurate building it could be. So this is all part of the both the work of the World Centre and the development of the World Centre. Now when you go on pilgrimage, you see so much more than used to be seen. We have these wonderful archives in the Holy Land, the things that belonged to Baha'u'llah and to the Bab and to Abdul Baha and to some degree to Shoghi Effendi, to the greatest holy leaf. And the pilgrims visit these and see them. You now see many, many more than I did when I went on pilgrimage. When I went on pilgrimage in May 1957, it was very intimate. The archives, the major archives then, were in the 3 rooms at the back of the Shrine of the Bab. And we were taken in, Lotfullah Hakim showed us round, and he would get the pilgrims to sit round in a semicircle on the floor, because there were very few pilgrims, and he'd open a cabinet, and he'd take out a garment and say, now this is one of the shirts of Baha'u'llah, and he would hand it round to the pilgrims, and you'd sort of, you'd be hardly daring to touch it, to hand it round and look at it and hand it back to him, and he put it away again. It was a wonderful experience, but you can't keep doing it for 2,000 or 3,000 years. So that's why the Guardian had the archives building constructed and had prepared ways of placing the precious archives that they could be seen appropriately, but not continually touched. And in the case of the archives, which are the tablets, which of course are the most precious of all, they're the sacred word, there are even tablets from Baha'u'llah saying how to look after the tablets. And the archives department follows that now. For example, you have an original tablet of Baha'u'llah's. One thing they first do is they test it for acidity. Because if a paper is acidic, you just leave it, it'll fall apart sooner or later. So they have to check that. Then they have a double sheet like this of acid-free paper. And they place the tablet in that, and that then goes in a folder. As far as possible, never again is the original tablet touched. If the archives wants to look at it, they take it out, and they open the folder and read the tablet. Now, if it's written on both sides, you don't pick the tablet up and turn it over. You close the folder again, turn it all over, and then open it again. Now, this is the sort of thing that Baha'u'llah thought of and told us how to do when dealing with things like that. I remember shortly after we got our first archivist, I made the mistake of going to make some notes of things she was talking to me about by taking out my ballpoint pen. She nearly had a fit. She says, you never use a ballpoint pen on a table where there is an original document. And I said, I'm not going to write on it. She said, no, of course you're not, but you might drop the pen. So only a pencil goes anywhere near the table where you have an original document. Now these are things that the friends at the World Centre learn, and they're very important. So there's a great discipline to serving at the World Centre of learning from the people who have skills, who have been brought there to do this sort of work. It's useless if you, as a member of the House of Justice, you go and say, look, I'm a member of the House of Justice, I'm going to read this tablet the way I want to. Oh no. The archivist says how you deal with things. And then the documents are very precious. You know, the people, the friends who wrote to any of the central figures of the faith, and including those who write to the House of Justice, pour out their hearts. Friends used to write to the Guardian about all sorts of personal problems, about things which they didn't want people to learn, to read about. They were talking to their Guardian. So there are rules of access to the documents. When Mr. Hoffman, for example, was writing the biography of the Hand of the Cause, George Townsend, he knew George very well. They were close friends. He needed to have access to some of the correspondence from George Townsend to the Guardian. And he asked the House of Justice for permission. And the House of Justice agreed on the provision that first they must be read by someone who did not know George Townsend. And he would then know whether there was anything in that letter that it was likely that George would not have wanted David Hoffman to read. And only when the documents are being cleared was David Hoffman then allowed to read them and use them in writing the biography of George Townsend. So this may seem very secretive, but it isn't secretive. There's a difference. The Guardian said once, there are no secrets in Haifa. There are things that are confidential, but that's not the same. The faith does not have secrets. It has mysteries. It has things that are confidential, but not secret things that nobody can see. So this is the essence of the World Centre, the way it deals with things. Now, since the House of Justice was elected, of course, the World Centre has grown. I think I counted the number of Baha'is living in Haifa about the time the House of Justice was elected, and if I remember rightly, there were 46. That wasn't including the custodians of the holy places, who were in fact Baha'is living permanently in Israel. But the others were there. There was the members of the House of Justice, the hands of the cause, their spouses, and then, of course, at that time there was no international teaching centre. And they did everything. The guy did the shrines, went to see the tax inspectors, made sure the gardens were kept in good order, everything. But you can't carry on like that as with a growing religion. So slowly, the House of Justice has been...
Step forward a tiny bit, you're making the evidence. Thank you.
What am I doing?
I was terrified going for all that.
Oh, thank you very much, yes. I'm glad you were terrified. I'd have been more than terrified. The friends had to come from all over the world to be brought to serve in the World Centre. And gradually, the House of Justice has brought friends now, and as now you know, there must be about 700 Baha'is serving there. There are some who are there for a long time, some for 2.5 years, or some in between, and many youth who go for a year or 18 months. And it is a wonderful thing for the life of the World Centre to have these friends going there. And it's part of the development of the nature of the World Centre, that we have in fact a living, functioning Baha'i community of some 700 people at the World Centre. I think it's a sign of the bounty of God that with all this, the House of Justice has been totally spared the problem of covenant breaking at the World Centre. When you think of what the Guardian had to work with all his life, being continually frustrated and criticized and troubled by disloyalty among those who are closest to him. And this, the House of Justice has been spared. Maybe the time is going to come when the House of Justice will have to face that sort of problem. I pray not. Maybe the faith's grown past that stage. But there are problems at the World Centre, as you know now. We just had 171 pilgrims, the first time that I know of where they've been on pilgrimage while Haifa has been showered with rockets. It was a quite unique pilgrimage. And this is a thing we have to expect also, that the World Centre can often be in danger. We pray hard, we do what we can to protect it, but there's a limit. The House of Justice building was being constructed. The question was, should we have a vast, great, deep, atom-proof air shelter? It's impossible. You can't. There are things you can't guard against. You do all you can that's reasonable, and then God has to look after the rest. And He does a pretty good job, actually. But every now and again, we lose things. I mean, in Iran, we've lost the House of the Bab. It's not the first time, though, it's been destroyed. And the House of Justice has exact details of the plans of the House of the Bab and the surrounding buildings. And it can reconstruct that any time we have access to that site. They won't be the same bricks and mortar as the old building, but it can reconstruct the House of the Bab. And this is what the Guardian said about the World Centre. Well, if it gets bombed, we build it again. And the faith is quite indestructible in many ways. You think of the Kitabia Iran, for example. Not only do we have the original tablet, but say that was destroyed. The Kitabia Iran has been published in the original in hundreds of thousands of copies. It's been translated into languages beyond belief. How can that ever be lost? Absolutely impossible. So with much of our scriptures. Even if many of the writings were lost. Remember Baha'u'llah himself, when he was in Baghdad, concluded that some of the things he'd revealed could not be shared with mankind, and he washed them out in the river. So we have a tremendous treasure in these tablets. But there's I think, a warning to mankind in general that the world against which we are warned is anything which divides us from God. Anything which divides us from God. And if we are faithful and follow God, we can have the other things. If we are not, then we lose the other things. I think this is what's happening, for example, to many of the churches in Christendom. We have these beautiful buildings here. We have the magnificent cathedrals around the world. And I was reading an article recently about Germany, where the number of churches that are being pulled down are just destroyed or sold as blocks of flats is tremendous, and they're now building new mosques in Germany. You see? Now I think there's also a very wonderful passage in the questions and answers to the Kitab al-Aqdas. Someone asked Baha'u'llah, what will happen to all these churches and monasteries and beautiful things, the other religions? And what do we do with them? He says, a building that has been used for the worship of the one true God is not to be used for anything else. Then the Guardian has listed this passage under the heading of Mashraq al-Azkar in his synopsis and codification of the Aqdas. So you deduce from that if it so happens that, for example, Westminster Abbey survives and Britain becomes a Baha'i country and we find ourselves with Westminster Abbey, it becomes a Mashraq al-Azkar. It remains a place of worship of God. So with all these beautiful things, if mankind will accept God, God will let us have these. But what's happening in so many cases, that people are not becoming Baha'is, and they're losing their own churches. They're becoming bingo halls. And this, I think, is so with anybody. If anything is going to keep people from God, He will let us lose that. Maybe this is a lesson for the Baha'is in Iran at the moment, certainly for the Iranians. Part of the heritage, the most precious heritage of Iran, are the Baha'i holy places. So in future, Iranians will remember that at this period in our history, our government seized and destroyed these holy places. Some of them, fortunately, thank God, most of them survive. But rather than let the Iranians lose the faith, God will let them lose the Baha'i holy places. So this we have to remember in everything we do, that however precious a thing is, if it becomes a barrier between us and God, God will take it away for our own good sakes. So the future of the World Centre is, I think, going to proceed much as it's been developing now. In other words, as the work requires development, the institutions to carry out that work are brought into being and made to operate by the Universal House of Justice. I can't see exactly what they'll be, because we never know how the faith is going to develop. I don't think we could have foreseen that after the passing of the Guardian, the House of Justice would solve the problem of there not being any more hands by creating the institution of the councillors. But it did, and they're functioning. And this whole arm of the administrative order for the protection and propagation of the faith is humming throughout the world. And we're learning slowly how to use it in relation to the elected institutions. We are learning how to function a world government so that we can show mankind how it should be done. And there are many, many areas in our work that we're doing this. The Baha'i community, you may say, is a living experiment where we are putting things to the test and showing that they work. And the same is true of the World Centre. That to have one point in the world which is divinely guided, which can keep the whole ship on its course, without, as it were, in detail directing every single thing in the world. The communities have their own degree of independence, is a marvelous example for mankind. The Guardian said, I remember when I was on pilgrimage, I think it was the Hand of the Cause, Hermann Grossman, asked the Guardian, a question. He said the Guardian had said that in essentials we must be uniform. In all secondary matters we should be diverse. So he said, well, what are the essentials? For example, in the question of functioning of assemblies. He says, the essentials are in the Constitution of the National Assembly. The Declaration of Trust and Bylaws are the essential things that must be the same for all national assemblies. Other things are secondary. So you find, for example, one country differs from another in what happens if a delegate moves away from the place they live between the time they're elected and the time of the International Convention. Different national assemblies have different solutions to that. Okay, that's nice. And there are many things like that. We're going to learn how to operate among one another and among our different countries with a degree of rigidity or formality, universality in essentials, but a great deal of diversity in secondary matters. Now that's, I've spoken longer than I ought to have, sorry. Do we still have any time for little questions? Yeah. David? Okay. Does anyone have any questions you want to ask? Yes, please.
I wondered what contingency plans the House of Justice has if, for example, communication is cut off from the World Centre. Another question which I didn't know the answer to is, if God forbid anything happened to the House of Justice, who arranges for an election?
Okay. I'll take it back to front. Yes, if the House, say a bomb drops on the House of Justice and all 9 members are killed, it's very easy to solve. You elect a new House of Justice. Members aren't the House of Justice, you're elected as before. And the election process is very simple. The question is, who calls it? I think the House of Justice, from time to time, makes provision for who should do this. At the present time, it will be the councillors. Now, I can't remember exactly how the councillors are to do it, but the House of Justice has given instructions, and all the councillors know what they should do if it should happen. And the basic thing is to keep the whole World Centre carrying on working. Now, the communication, the Guardian himself said that the time could well come that the World Centre is cut off from the Friends. We have our national institutions. They continue to direct their communities and keep in harmony with one another. And this is becoming much stronger now once we have this present pattern of the training institutes. Because as things happened quite recently in Africa, there was one country, I've forgotten which it was, where they'd only recently, the Friends had got their training institutes going. And they had the books, they had the things, and they were doing it. There was a war, and this section of the country was completely cut off from the rest, and the poor National Assembly was worried, thinking, what are these Baha'is going to do? They had no contact with them. Eventually they re-established contact, and they found believers were carrying on happily. They said, we didn't need to contact the National Assembly. We know what to do. We have the books, we have our children's classes, we have our study circles, we have devotional meetings, and we're doing all right, thank you very much. We didn't need to ask for anything from the National Assembly at the moment. So by the training of the community, as distinct from just the teaching of the faith, in a particular method of doing things, we're making the community more decentralized. It may seem the opposite. It may seem there's a uniformity being established, but it's a certain uniformity, but also a degree of independence, devolution. Any other questions? Oh, yes, please.
Just something, when you talk about the International Council,
Yes.
that had women.
Oh, yes.
Then eventually the Universal House of Justice would be elected. And I think one of the words that the Guardian used, this body would effervesce into the Universal House of Justice. Well, the Universal House of Justice, of course, was elected.
Yes.
The council was appointed. Can you just have some comment on that? Because sometimes there's a sticking point.
Yes, it's very interesting because, of course, as you say, the council, when it was first brought into being as the embryo of the Universal House of Justice, was appointed by the Guardian. And it had both men and women on it. I wish I had time to speak about these friends, they were wonderful people. Then the Guardian said it would be elected, and then later would infloresce into the Universal House of Justice. So the first election was in 1961, and all the National Assemblies elected exactly as they would in an election for the Universal House of Justice. It was done by mail, The only thing was that they elected men and women, and otherwise it was the same. And it so happened that what happened was they re-elected onto the council the ones who had been on the appointed council who weren't hands of the cause, because the first council, many of its members became hands, or in some cases hands became members of the council. And the hands asked not to be elected to the elected council. And so the members who had been on before were re-elected, and the National Assembly has elected new members to make up the ones who places have been vacated by the hands. And that was the International Council as an elected body. And it functioned under the direction of the hands until 1963. And one of its tasks was to help to the hands to prepare for the election of the Universal House of Justice. Then in the election of the House of Justice in 1963, the National Assemblies did the same thing again. The only difference being they didn't elect any women. And that body was then the Universal House of Justice. Yeah. Well, perhaps it's... Are you holding it? That's right. Oh, one more. Okay, one more.
There have been some claims that the voting process for the House Justice and also for the National Spiritual Assemblies isn't...
Sorry, I can't quite understand. Can you speak louder?
Some people that I've been talking to have said that the voting procedure isn't absolutely perfect because, for example, the National Spiritual Assembly of India, the makeup of it has been very similar for the past 20 years or so, because people that get voted on are people who people have heard of, who are people on the National Spiritual Assembly. What's required to have to these activities?
Yes. Well, it's quite true that the elections are not perfect. In fact, nothing's perfect at the moment. Because we're in the very early stages of, you think we're only halfway through the 2nd century, very early stages of learning how to operate the faith. So in most countries, the delegates haven't really learned to be quite clear thinking when they elect. But then we also have to remember that the Baha'i concept of election and of service is not the same as that in the world as a large. One is meant to elect the people one thinks, the individuals one believes, are the best to serve. There's no particular reason why that should change radically every year. Now, usually what has happened is there's been a gradual changeover as people get older and die or move off or pioneer or something, or the believers decide they want someone else elected. In fact, I remember not too long ago, one National Assembly, which at Rizwan, it had been rather a poor National Assembly, and all 9 members were changed at that convention. No preconditions, no one thought about it. It just so happened that the delegates thought, whoops, we'll vote for these ones. So the Baha'i elections is an interesting and unusual thing. But remember, Baha'i elections do not carry out in order to obtain power. They are carried out so that the believers can confer authority on those they want to take charge of the community. It's a very different pattern from normal elections. So as you're right, things are imperfect, and we just have to work hard and study how to function and get better. Thank you, David.